Kind of interesting to look out over all these chairs. A few people in them. It's significant to me. The TED Talk that Greg just showed has a lot of points, but one of the big points is you have to be very careful making judgments on what you see. And that what you see, we have a tendency to make conclusions, and you're never going to be right unless you take the time to find out what's going on. I cannot think of her name right now, but there's a famous movie actress. Maybe somebody can help me. She's a beautiful lady. What's that? No. This is back. Anyway, when you would look at her, she was the picture of beauty, elegance, success. Rita Hayworth, Joey knew. One of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Just to look at her, and she was very successful in an actress, as being an actress, but her life was a series of tragedies because men would almost put her on a pedestal. She had several failed marriages, and she spent her life feeling unloved. And your first thought was the last thing you would think. And this week, on March 17th, is St. Patrick's Day, which you probably all know. And he's an interesting person to research, but we're not going to do that today. It's Purim. And one of the features of Purim, is that what you think is not what actually is. And that you have to take a little bit of time and dig under the surface. And, again, this... Am I ringing? The TED Talk, when you look at that fellow, then he described somewhat dispassionately his mother's inability to even look at him. And then it took over a month before they brought him home. And you realize somewhere in his life he'd come to the place where he made the decisions, what was going to matter to him, and he was not going to let life determine his response. His response would be his choice, like owning his face. And Purim, when you read the story on the surface, it's easy to miss the point. And I remember years ago we went to a conference in Arizona. And John Smith, you probably remember John Smith, he prayed. He would have these meetings and then they would pray for people. This is the time when Bill Hammond was also working with him. Bill Hammond is still alive. John's passed away. But John had quite a prophetic gift in praying for people. And this man came up to be prayed for. And he reeked of tobacco smoke. And John's first reaction is, I've got to pray that this man gets delivered from nicotine. And he was just getting ready to do it, and the Holy Spirit said, this man's not even a smoker. Oh, okay. And so he backed off, and we found out he was with some people who smoked. This man never smoked at all. That wasn't his problem at all. But that was what John jumped to because that's what he saw. That's the appearances. And I think most of you realize we have a tendency to judge on externals, and sometimes I don't know what's wrong here, but hearing myself once is enough. Am I in the wrong place, maybe? All right, let's try that. Is that better? Yeah. Anyway, and I was reminded of this as I was thinking about Purim. This past week, I did a really dumb thing. I think we probably all have had our chance to do that. I push up the feed with the four-wheeler. It has a blade on it, and that's how we push the feed back up next to the manger so the cows can eat it. And the handle that snaps the blade up doesn't work without tying it up. Well, I didn't tie it up, somebody else did. And it was on the first loop. It needs to be on 2 loops or the blade's not high enough. And so I'm driving, standing up, looking at the cows like I do, and the blade was low enough it caught the concrete pad. So that the four-wheeler was going about 15 miles an hour, and I was too. Then the four-wheeler was stopped, and I was going 15 miles an hour. And it was kind of painful. I've been trying to reconstruct what happened because I just kind of woke up on my back on the ground. The front of me was completely clean. I was covered with mud, and my arm hurt. I got up and I was doing that thing you do when you knock your breath out. Everybody enjoy that, where you're whistling and sucking air and looking around hoping nobody saw that. But here's the thing, all that to describe it. My arm is just this lovely color, because I already had another bruise on there. My arm doesn't even bother me. Right here, you can't see a thing. It bothers me. If you were to just look and draw a conclusion, you should say, John hurt his arm. I did, but that's it. Honestly, what hurts is I must have bruised a rib. The only way you'll find that out is to dig a little deeper. Life is that way, and that I don't know about you, that video disturbed me and was powerful to me. Because I have a tendency to look at things and judge them, and very often that initial judgment, we think we are discerning. It's not discernment, it's judgment, and it's based on externals. The story of Purim is a story that, in fact, you probably are aware of this. Some people thought it shouldn't be in the Bible. Esther. Because the name of God is never mentioned. And there's nothing religious about the story. I'm going to go over the story again just a little. And you know the story, but the important thing and the important message of Esther is underneath. If you don't take the time to look for it, you miss it. It starts with, we call him Artaxerxes, but his name is Ahasuerus. We'll call him Artaxerxes. He holds this huge feast, and I'm sure you all remember it. It goes on for days and weeks. And at the end, when he's stone drunk and not very sane, he commands his queen to come parade herself in front of him and his consort, the other guys that are there with him. I've never understood why she would be judged, because my first thought if I were her was, no way. But she wouldn't come. And this set off this chain reaction. Oh, if we do this, all the women in the kingdom won't respect their husbands. They won't respect their rule over them. And you're thinking, oh, this is the original male chauvinist pig book. And she's deposed as queen. The next thing we find is that the king is going to find a new queen. And if you're honest, this is kind of disgusting. These girls go through a year of treatments. Oils and all kinds of things to condition their skin, and then perfumes. And there's a girl named Esther, who's actually Jewish, who enters it's not a lottery, what is it? Beauty contest, who knows what it is. But she's an orphan, and she's been raised by her uncle, a man named Mordecai. And he specifically tells her, do not ever tell anybody you're a Jew. So we start off in this story by maybe the most important characteristic of the story, we're not to know it. First thing she does is when she goes through this process is she discovers and she develops a relationship with the king's eunuch. And I think I might have his name here. Haggai, I think his name is. Whatever. Anyway. She finds out what he thinks would please the king, and she does everything based on what the eunuch tells her. And you probably all know what happened, is that they're allowed to take something of their choosing, and then they spend one night with the king, and they're evaluated. I don't know how this sounds to you. It sounds not good to me. In any case, she is chosen. And the king gives a big banquet, and she's officially designated as queen. Now, Mordecai works in the king's court, and one day, when he's there, he overhears some people talking. And as he listens, he notices that they're actually conspiring to assassinate Artaxerxes. Well, he gets a hold of somebody and lets the king know what this plan is. And the assassination plot is foiled, and the king's life is saved. One of the king's officials, a man named Haman, and it's really, in Hebrew it would never be Haman, it'd be Haman. But he's been exalted, lifted up to the chief viceroy for the king. And because of his elevation, his status, everyone in the court bows down to Mordecai every time they pass him. Not Mordecai. Haman. Except there's one exception. Mordecai will not bow down to Haman. Well, this makes Haman very angry. And one of the things very interesting in the story, it's kind of a picture of not only anti-Semitism, but the hatred of other groups of people. Mordecai's a Jew, and he upsets Haman, so instead of trying to hurt Mordecai, Haman decides to destroy the Jewish race, and he gets together with his friends, and they cast lots. That's where the name of Purim comes from. The lot is a pour, P-U-R. We have a tendency to say pure, but that's not what it is. Doesn't matter. And they get the king to sign a decree that on the 13th of Adar, which is the 12th month, or as in this year, it's the 13th month, because we have two Adars, Adar 1, Adar 2. And you know what day they made this, he cast the lots? It was Nisan 13. Now what's significant about Nisan 13? What happens on Nisan 14? Passover. So in the first month, just the day before the lamb is slain, they cast these lots, and they decide they're going to destroy all the Jews in the province. Well, Mordecai hears about this, and he's horrified, and because of the history that the Jews have been through since the scattering of the northern tribes and then the southern tribes being taken into exile, he's beyond upset. And they sent letters out to all of the provinces in Persia that on the 13th of Adar they were to kill and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, and to seize their possessions as plunder. The only real parallel to this is the Holocaust. Anyway, so Mordecai finds out about this, and all the Jews in the place where they're living, I think it's Shushan, go into terrible mourning, sackcloth and ashes. And Esther hasn't heard about this. So she asks Mordecai what happened. And he makes an interesting comment. He says, you need to do something about this. Don't think just because you're the queen that you... He says, who knows whether or not you became queen for this reason? And so she's reluctant to get involved. But she says, okay, me and all my attendants will go on a 3-day fast. We're asking all of you to do the same thing. She says, I have not seen the king for a month, and for me to walk into his royal chamber. And the best way to look at that is if you know the setup of the tabernacle, where you have an outer court, an inner court, and the most holy place, is the king is in the most holy place. There's an outer court everybody can go into. The inner court, just those who are invited. To go into the king, you do not go in there unless you're invited, because you're instantly killed. They don't even ask, because they don't. The only thing that will save is if the king reaches out his scepter. And she says, well, if he reaches out his scepter, I'll take my chances. So when she comes before the king after these 3 days of fasting, he immediately reaches out to her with his golden scepter. And he asked her, what's troubling you? What's your request? He says, even to half the kingdom it will be given to you. I've always wondered why kings are always giving away half the kingdom. But in this case, she says, well, I'd like to have you and Haman have a banquet with me today. And so they have this banquet. And she says, what I'd like you to do is do this again tomorrow. And now Haman is feeling very elevated by this. He's feeling like he has reached the pinnacle. And you'll notice the way this story works again, everything that seems to be is not. So, he's full of pride and arrogance, and guess who he runs into? Mordecai. And Mordecai doesn't do what? He doesn't bow down again. And all this anger comes. And he goes home just furious, and he's so angry, he tells his family. And so they say, well, let's build a gallows, and we'll hang Mordecai on it. And so the next day, before they have their banquet, he's going to ask the king if it's given permission to hang Mordecai. Well, that night, the king has insomnia. Some of you don't know what that is. I think a few of you here know what insomnia is. Couldn't sleep. And you know what one of the best solutions for insomnia? Listening to someone read history. And so he got a couple of his attendants to read him the court records. And as they're going through there, he goes, who's this Mordecai? He saved my life. What did we do for him? I didn't know about this. I mean, he said, something should be done about him. And so early the next morning, Haman's coming to the palace to ask Artaxerxes for permission to hang Mordecai on his gallows. Well, while he's coming, the king is sitting there. What should I do for Mordecai? I've got to reward him for what he did in saving my life. And so when Haman shows up, the king has a request. He says, what should I do what should be done for the man that I want to honor? And guess who Haman thinks that is? This story, I defy you to go back to the book of Esther and notice the number of things that seem to be that aren't. So he says, well, the man the king desires to honor. Let them bring the royal robe which the king has worn, the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Haman thought, I'm giving him a recipe for me. Artaxerxes looks at him and says, I want you to do this for Mordecai. Thank you. Great idea. I love this story. Anyway, so poor Haman spends the whole day leading Mordecai around on the king's horse, wearing the king's robe, wearing the king's crown, and saying, this is what the king does for the man he desires to honor. Well, at this point, something's not right. He goes home, he's in disgrace, and his wife and his counselors tell him, you're in trouble. They say, and for some reason they have picked out the idea that because Mordecai is Jewish, you have put yourself in a bad situation. So in the middle of this upheaval, The king's men arrived to take Haman to the banquet. Well, here, Esther finally does what she's been told not to do. She says, I am a Jew. And there is this proclamation, this decree you've made is going to destroy not only all my people, but me too. And the king said, well, who did this? And she says, it's this man, Haman. Well, the king is so angry, he can't even stay in the room. He has to go out into the garden. Well, while he's out there cooling off, Haman does the absolute dumbest thing he could ever do, because this story constantly is having these kind of things happen. He falls on the couch before Esther, pleading for his life. So the king comes back in and he says, what are you doing? Are you accosting the queen? And those words came out of his mouth, and we don't understand the way things work in those days. His servants heard that. They just covered Haman's head with a cloak and took him out. And of course, he was hanged on the gallows built for Mordecai. Now Esther pleads with the king to reverse the decree. Well, you all know about the laws of the Medes and the Persians. You can't reverse them. So what he does do is he makes it possible for the Jews to defend themselves. And he changes the whole thing so what was a day of disgrace for the Jews becomes a day of great victory and great honor. And it goes on to be, it talks about Mordecai as elevated to one of the king's chief counselors. The royal robe is put on him, and actually all of Haman's estate is given to Mordecai. What's that? Joy said my watch was beeping, but you'd have to talk to my ears. In any case, all right, all that, probably all of you knew the story. This is where the celebration of Purim comes from, is from this day that was to be a day of destruction became a day of triumph and victory. One of the things that I think is very important as we come upon this day is to recognize that if you evaluate situations and your life on what the appearances are, you'll often be wrong or you will miss the point. And I'll just go through a list of things here now. The story starts off with this big banquet, and Vashti is banished, but out of that, Esther is made queen. Mordecai just happens to hear the conspiracy against the king and foils it. Haman and his conspirators use lots to choose the day to destroy the Jews of the empire, and that they do this on the 13th of Nisan, like I mentioned to you. Esther is reluctantly dragged into a plan to subvert Haman's plan by her uncle. Her plan is instigated by a 3-day fast and then an appearance before the king. Haman is so enraged by Mordecai's continuing refusal to bow before him, he builds a gallows. And we all know what happened. When he went to ask permission to hang Mordecai, he ends up honoring Mordecai. The king gladly accepts Esther and agrees to 2 meals together with Esther and Haman. The second meal, she reveals her identity and asks for her people to be spared. Haman is hung on the gallows intended for Mordecai. Mordecai receives the signet ring from the king and is put over Haman's estate. The day is decreed. It's the day that was decreed for destruction, because it becomes a day of great victory. And the Jewish identity, which was the whole cause of the whole story's pain, tribulation, and the source of destruction, becomes the sign of God's favor. And I put the word God in there. The word God is never mentioned in the book. Here's the thing that you need to understand. We all do. You all understand probabilities. Maybe you don't, because I read people's posts. Probabilities are important. I'll use a simple example. In biology, in just a normal population, about 50% of the children born are going to be boys, and 50% are going to be girls. It's actually, at conception, a little higher for boys. By birth, it's still a little higher. By the time you hit 20, the girls have caught up, and by the time you get old, the boys are way behind. But it's still about half and half. If something happened in a population where over 10,000 births, we had 80% boys, we would know something was different. We would know something was acting. That's one thing. You have over 10 things in the book of Esther that keep going against what you would expect. Why is this book in the Bible? To show that God's hand is moving when you miss it, when you're not aware of it. I mean, when you start the book, you're thinking the worst thing in the world is to be a Jew. There's a danger in Purim. What's the danger in Purim? Where should the children of Israel be? Where are they? They're in Persia. They should be in their land. The danger of God saving His people in the dispersion is they get comfortable there. I will never know why the Holocaust happened other than wicked people did wicked things. And God has given us free agency. I do know that the Holocaust functioned in Jews realizing until they had their own country, they'd never be safe. Because how many times has Purim happened? Over and over and over. And if you read Facebook, the Jewish conspiracy theories are just flowing again. It's one of those crazy things. Yep. Yeah, Putin is using some of this, and it's kind of like, whoa. And I thought of something. How many of you watched The Lion King the last couple of days? There's a powerful message in that silly story. What was Simba tempted to do? He was tempted to stay with, I wrote their names down, Timon and Pumbaa. Where was he supposed to be? He was so tempted because what was happening there, I wrote that word down too. Is it Hakuna Matata? I don't know. I don't know Swahili. But I mean, the story is fabulous. I got thinking, this analytical mind I have, which is sometimes a pain in the neck, but I'm looking and thinking, whoever wrote this story really described human existence. We're called to be something. We hit pain, we hit tribulation, we lose important people. But we don't. We don't lose them. We thought we did. We go to a place away and we get comfortable. We get comfortable away from where we're supposed to be. And I didn't even know what a meerkat was. Anybody here know what a meerkat is? I had to look all these things up. I do know that Danielle was a meerkat. That I did know that. And a kind of funny one. But seriously, what you see happening in the story is that it's an evolution, it's a change, it gradually unfolds. But Simba is never who he is called to be till he's back king. And that, what is this? The Pride, what is that? Pride Rock. On Pride Rock. And you know, this year we talked about this last year, entering the inheritance for Levi and Aaron. And we wanted to spend some more time on that. And you know what? It hit me that you and I have the same danger that Simba did. And we get comfortable out of our country. And bones. There's such a danger of getting comfortable outside of your country. In fact, most people are not aware that when Yeshua was born, more Jews lived in Babylon than lived in the land of Israel. And you've all celebrated the Seder before. How do we conclude the Seder? Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Why do we say that? Because that's our home. That's where the king comes. But have you ever discovered this thing about human beings, that we can say something and we can repeat it over and over and have no intention of ever doing it? And so as I was thinking about this today, and Purim is this week, and we're entering into the feast season, and it's really important for Levi and Aaron. It's important for all of Israel. It's important for God's people. And in many ways, your heart needs to come home before your body ever will. And it's complex today. In fact, both Isaiah 49 and Zechariah 10 tell us that there will be so many Israelites they won't fit in the land. So we understand, but I say this over and over. Until your heart is focused on Jerusalem, the Bible will not read properly. There's one reason that Jeroboam went down the trail he went. And it was because he did not want to go to Jerusalem. He did not start out with an intent to get rid of the priests and Levites. He did not start out with the intent to change the feasts. He did not start out with the intent to make golden images. What he started out with is, if I let my people go back to Jerusalem, they're going to return to a son of David. So I'm going to do anything I can to keep him out of Jerusalem. Christians have struggled with this. Because, in fact, I see stuff today God's done with Jerusalem. I have a fellow I know him fairly well. I've met him, talked to him, and then a Facebook friend, and I've had to just about get rid of him because I've watched him start down this trail of anti-Semitism. And it's taken a few years, but now he's spouting stuff out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you've never read that, don't. The people that wrote it admitted it was a hoax. But it's the instrument of millions of Jews dying because of stuff that's made up. But see, he's come to this place where God doesn't have anything to do with that land. The most evil people in the world are the Zionists. The Zionists are ruining the world. It's a little bit like Dylan Roof shooting the blacks in that church that so graciously invited him in there because blacks are ruining the U.S. All that just to bring something out. I want you to be thinking, those of you who are here, or those who are connected with us in any way, what are you going to do in this next year that's a step toward your inheritance? What in your inheritance have you not grasped a hold of? What are you afraid of? Who is your Pumbaa and Timon? Which I thought is kind of nice because they end up in the kingdom with him. But there are a couple of things that I think are important that I'll just mention today. The first tribe to be restored is always going to be Levi. Why? Which tribe does not have to be in the land to be restored? Levi. Why? They don't have a territory. Kaya, do you have to do it?
Well, the other aspect.
That's very good what Kaya points out. Every time there's a restoration, a revival, the first thing that will happen is to restore the place of worship, and to restore the place of worship, you restore the priests and the Levites. In the desert, Levi and Aaron come into their inheritance, don't they? When you read the book, Exodus 29 and Exodus 28 talk about making Aaron's robes, setting him apart, giving the priesthood, building the tabernacle, and then Numbers talks about setting apart the Levites. All of this can happen because they are not connected to dirt. Zebulun, Issachar, Benjamin, none of those tribes are in their inheritance till they cross the Jordan, except for Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, who got theirs on. We're in this time, and I think a lot of people see the unrest, the disturbance in the world, and they're looking for bad things to happen. I talked a little bit to you last time. There are some bad things happening. There are people dying right now. I mean, can you imagine what's going on in the Ukraine? And I will admit, Ukraine terrifies me in this sense. I hope it doesn't provoke a nuclear. But what I do know, whether or not that happens, is God is gathering His people. It's a day where He's calling His family together. And so, how does that look for you and for me? How do we work? People need to have hope for today. Counting the dead people in Ukraine, which is just sickening to me, there's just some real heartbreaking stories. There's a mother and her 2 kids. The husband went away to get a place for them to go to, and there was a church worker that came and got the mother and the 2 kids, bringing him to the train station. They were hit by a Russian mortar. Civilians, right in the middle of broad daylight in the middle of the city. It killed all 4 of them. And one of the things it points out to you is that when you really want something and you have objectified people, people will become stepping stones to achieving your goal, but they don't matter. If there's anything that Levi and Aaron can't do, or the house of Israel, is the people are always the most important thing. They're not objects. They're people made in God's image. And I think it's kind of interesting. There are a couple of passages here. I'm trying to see if I can find this. First Chronicles 9 tells us the first exiles to return to their former towns were priests, Levites, and temple servants. And why would that be? It was just what Kaya said, that when people return to the Lord, they come to their place of worship. What can we be doing today? One of the first things I want to stir up in you is don't let go of the dream God put in you for Him to restore His house. If there's anything that Satan would like to do, it's to take that away from us. So we get up in the morning and we say, Hakuna Matata. This is great. Let's just keep going. Entering your inheritance is a little uncomfortable. There's something infinitely preferable about the peace in Persia. The problem is you're never home, and there's always another Purim to come down the road too. I would like you to think about some things I just wrote down. Some specifics. I think, I don't know about the rest of you, I have found myself having a crisis of confidence, maybe the best way to put it. Sometimes I look around me and I say, Lord, what's happening? What are we doing? Where's this going? And the Holy Spirit has told me over and over, it is not my job to worry about that. My job is to do what He told me to do. I don't know about you, there are times I look up and I think, where are all the people? Where are all these Aaronites and these Levites and the Israelites? When I look at the Israelites, it seems like we spend more energy fighting each other than we do coming together. But the Lord, He's pretty good at accomplishing what He plans to do. And I think when you look at Matthew 24, when you look at Luke 21, and they talk about the shaking in the end times, so much of that actually happened about 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. But even that looks forward to us. Our emphasis is not on the bad times. Our emphasis is on what is God doing now. Like, He's going to bring His people together. He's going to establish them. So one thing I would like you to remember. What unique characteristic allowed Levi to enter his inheritance first? We already mentioned it. His inheritance is a ministry. It's not a place. He never had a function till Israel became a nation. And outside of Israel, the house of Levi and Aaron has no function. There's not a place. There's an interesting statement in 243. It says, the house of Aaron is a house to the tribes of Israel. And as the church has gone through this 2,000-year phase where we kind of lost our identification with Israel, that's changing. A whole lot of the church now is reconnecting to their Hebraic base, who they are. And some of them are confused because they see the Jews as all of Israel and them not part of Israel. One of the most important things that you can do today is to tell believers that it says in Galatians 3 that as many as believe are the sons, the seed of Abraham. And it's speaking of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Are the Jews. They are legitimately Israel. They're another part of Israel. Levi's function is to Israel. If you're wondering where the Levites are and the Israelites are, maybe we need to wake people up to who they are. Or let the Holy Spirit wake them up. You know, you think about Simba. He had decided he didn't want to be what he was born to be. You're going to find millions of people that don't want to be Israel. Until they find out, yes, they really do want to be. We talked about this. Why is it important for Levi to be restored first in some sense? Because Israel, to find their identity, they need a functioning house of Levi and Aaron. And another interesting thing that you probably are aware of is that when they came into the land, how did they know where to go? Joshua and Eleazar, through the leading of the Lord, said, this is where Naphtali goes. This is where Issachar goes. This is where Zebulun goes. Manasseh was half here. How many of you know when you tell people they're Israel, at some point you have to say, what part of Israel? What does it look like what God's called you to do? And you know what? This can't happen without God. This can't happen without the Holy Spirit speaking to people and saying, I know where you belong. I know where you connect. Finally, and bring this to a close, it's hard for Levi because he does not have a land inheritance. There's something that Levi misses not having a place in Israel that says, here's the land of Levi. But I remember going to conferences years ago, and we used to wear Levi on our pocket, or Aaron, and the ladies all wore these caps that said Levi. And I remember one conference we went to was a vineyard conference in Southern California. It was a really good conference. Having a good time worshiping with people, loved the whole thing. And somebody came up and saw Levi on my pocket. And it just, for some reason, just made him angry. And he said, aren't we all Levites? And I can't remember my answer, but I know it wasn't real intelligent and coherent. He was just, and another time when we were in North Carolina, this fellow was Jewish. His name was Levitt. He was angry that we were saying we were Levites because he felt like we were appropriating his identity. We're not all Levites. What would happen if all of Israel didn't have an inherited land? It couldn't be a nation. Your body can help you a little here. If you look at a body, it has organs all through it. It's got a heart, it's got a liver, it's got a gallbladder. But it has elements that go everywhere. Your blood. What organ does your blood belong to? All of them and none of them. The minute that blood said, I'm only staying here in the liver, the rest of your body's in big trouble. For blood to function, in fact, I've told you this before, the red blood cell loses its nucleus. It's the only functioning cell in the body that doesn't even have DNA, because it's given up its identity to serve the body. It couldn't do its job if it had an inheritance. So when you look at Levi and Aaron, they are different than some of Israel. It's not bad. They're not better. They're not worse. The lymph is similar. The nervous system is similar. You have things that belong everywhere. And so when someone is saying, well, we're all this, no, that's why we haven't. It's part of the reason that unity hasn't happened, because we thought unity is around a doctrine. Unity is around family. Unity is around we all are brothers and sisters. If you read the history of the church, we kill people that have the wrong beliefs. That paradigm is going to shift. And we're going to become a nation with our unique characteristics, all loving and serving each other. You look at even the nation of the U.S. now. When it's functioning correctly, all kinds of different people. You don't look at that person and say, well, you don't vote like I do, so you're not an American. If you do think that way, you're dumb. That's not how it works. But, so, all that's kind of a preparation. These next couple of weeks we're going to be talking about what actually can you and I be doing that helps us enter our inheritance. And as we enter our inheritance, what can we do to help others enter theirs? Because if you don't know you're in your inheritance, it loses its importance. And the body doesn't develop to the point that God intends it to. And of course, the promise is that he will take the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph, and he'll bring them together. And it's very significant in my mind that the man who holds those sticks is Ezekiel, who is an Aaronite. And of course, in the end, it's the father who brings those sticks together. But there's an element of the Levitical and Aaronic priesthood where they act for the father. If you don't believe me, read Malachi 1. But that's got you thinking about a lot of stuff. I think we're entering an exciting time in our nation's history, in the house of Levi and Aaron's history, and in the world's history. It's not all bleak, but we are going to face trials. And if you don't think so, again, remember what they're going through in Ukraine. And you know what? We can pray for the people in Ukraine without agreeing with everything that's going on. I found it kind of strange lately that we have people trying to make victims look bad. I'm not sure where that comes from. If you're called to the house of Levi and Aaron, it means, in a certain sense, your heart is going to break for everyone. Which is a good thing and a hard thing. But it's a good time. It's a time of rebuilding, and it's a time, like it says in John 11, he says, Caiaphas was saying, well, it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to die. And then John says, well, Caiaphas didn't realize what he was saying. He didn't realize that what he was saying was that Yeshua would give his life, and by giving his life, he would bring not only Judah together there in the land, but all his people over the face of the earth would be gathered into one nation. That's the time we're in now. Let's stand. Brother Ronald Crouch, would you close for us, please? Amen.